To unpack this further, I'm joined by Azim Ibrahim. He joins me from Chicago. He's the director of New Alliance Institute for Strategy and Policy. Great to have you here with us on TRT World. So it seems to me that NATO has hardened its stance on Beijing, calling China an enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, the primary discussion at the NATO summit has been on Ukraine and essentially pushing back on Russia's war efforts there and the various enablers. But the reality is that the central piece of the discussion, the biggest concern of all the NATO members there, is the election of a Trump presidency and the implications that would have for a NATO alliance, and whether Trump will actually pull out of NATO or whether he'll simply start defunding NATO. So even though Ukraine is taking center stage, we've seen the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, coming to NATO, meeting with the NATO memberships, and NATO members also indicating that they want to examine a path for Ukrainian membership. The Trump presidency is what's on everybody's mind.
And we are also hearing from NATO leaders that Ukraine's NATO membership is now irreversible. Do you think it's likely to happen anytime soon? And if so, when exactly? What's the timeline here? What are we looking at?
Well, they didn't say it's irreversible as such. They said that when the process starts, they'll make it irreversible. So it's very diplomatic language, very careful language in terms of not in any way indicating that Ukraine is going to get the membership and what the timeline may be. The reality is that nobody actually within NATO, many countries are not very keen on antagonizing Russia any further. They're not keen on extending NATO membership, which I believe is actually a mistake, because Ukraine is actually, if NATO wants to be a defensive alliance, and Ukraine has actually got the most formidable, the most well-trained, the most experienced, and the most well-equipped military in all of Europe. And so if there is going to be a defensive alliance of NATO of protecting Europe, Ukraine can certainly play the primary position of that.
Azim, this is what I wonder now. So Russia's war in Ukraine has been ongoing for over 2 years now. I wonder, what is NATO doing differently this time around? Because a similar summit took place last year. How do you think NATO's stance has changed over the past 2 years?
Well, the first thing is that we've seen that NATO membership is now the member countries are taking their own membership and their own obligations a little bit more seriously now. We have to remember that now only 23 out of the 32 countries are meeting their 2% defense spending requirement, 2% of GDP. Last year, there was only 10 countries that met that requirement. So defense spending across NATO is increasing. There is deep concern that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, that he will not stop there, that he will look further afield. So that is when NATO will become much more relevant to many of these countries. Many countries that simply do not take their own NATO membership very seriously. And this is what the central complaint of Trump has been, that these countries are never paid in, and they're simply not taking their membership seriously enough.
Azim Ibrahim, thanks very much for talking to us here on TRT World. I really appreciate your taking out the time.